I would like to acknowledge my co-authors and present results examining the response of the Escalante River Channel to the invasion and treatment of Russian olive. Russian olive is an invasive tree and now the fifth most common woody riparian species across 17 western states. Its establishment along the Escalante River, as with other regional rivers, caused channel narrowing and simplification, as Russian olive established on moist near channel bars along a wider braided channel prior to invasion. Sediment trapping and levee building by near channel Russian olive during floods severely narrowed the channel along portions of the Escalante. A simplified channel illustrated here along the Escalante resembles an irrigation ditch, and the lack of dynamic erosional and depositional processes along such a simplified channel and the lack of channel bar forms reduces aquatic habitat diversity, which is important for supporting aquatic biodiversity. Widespread narrowing and simplification of the Escalante River Channel prompted concern, and a large-scale Russian olive treatment effort was initiated aimed at reversing these changes. Given the magnitude of this restoration effort, we thought it was worth assessing the results of these treatments at a broad scale. Here's an example of pre- and post-treatment along the Escalante from Reach 4, with cottonwoods and willows and bands of near-channel Russian olive flanking the active channel prior to treatment in 2008. And later that year, following treatment, native vegetation and willows remaining along the active channel. Prior to 2017, smaller Russian olive stems overhanging the channel were cut and herbicide applied to the stump. Smaller diameter slash was placed in the active channel. Large diameter slash piles were generally left on the floodplain, and large upright trees on the floodplain were either girdled and left standing or felled into the river and cut up to facilitate river transport. We used ArcGIS Pro to map the wetted and unvegetated active channel from aerial photos before and during the Russian olive invasion and following treatment within 3 reaches upstream of Boulder Creek and 4 reaches downstream of Boulder Creek. This figure summarizes changes in channel width in meters over time for the 3 upstream and 4 downstream reaches. Important changes illustrated here to note are the following. 1, the Escalante River Channel was narrowing rapidly before the invasion of Russian olive, which began around 1980. Second, the channel continued to narrow, but more slowly during the Russian olive invasion and prior to treatment, which began around 2007. Third, channel narrowing during this period was slightly greater in upstream reaches. Fourth, during and following the treatment period, the channel widened slightly in upstream reaches, but continued to narrow in downstream reaches. And finally, channels across all reaches are now about the same width. These results raise some interesting questions. For example, why was the Escalante River Channel narrowing rapidly prior to Russian olive invasion? Second, why didn't Russian olive narrow the channel more over a period of about 25 to 30 years? And finally, why did the channel widen in upstream reaches following treatment, but continued to narrow in downstream reaches? Answering these questions requires some historical context, and a basic understanding of what drives channel form. Basically, river channel form responds continuously to interactions and feedbacks among the flow of water, the amount of movement of sediment, and the presence of vegetation. And understanding the responses of the Escalante River to the invasion and treatment of Russian olive is improved by viewing it in the context of long-term interactions among these factors. This photo, taken of the Escalante River at the mouth of Harris Wash in 1953, shows that the active or unvegetated portion of the channel was wide, with some new vegetation establishing on the tops of channel bars, as indicated by the yellow ellipse, and larger, older cottonwoods, like this one indicated by the green ellipse, were growing on higher surfaces adjacent to the active channel. 45 years later, at the same location, the channel has narrowed by about 70%. The large old cottonwood remains, and the formerly broad active channel is now largely occupied by stands of young cottonwoods, and the new narrower channel is closely lined by vegetation, including Russian olive, which participated later in the narrowing process, as mentioned. Why the Escalante River channel was wide in the mid-1950s and was narrowing rapidly before the invasion of Russian olive around 1980 can be understood by plotting channel width in meters, represented by this green line, against annual peak discharge of the Escalante River, or Qmax, represented by the light blue diamonds for the period 1905 through 1922. 4 exceptionally large floods occurred between 1909 and 1932, and the water from these floods washed out the Escalante River gauge and the bridge, cut and widened an arroyo, evacuating sediment and vegetation along the length of the Escalante, leaving the broad, unvegetated channel seen in the 1953 photo. But that 1953 photo also showed young vegetation establishing on a channel bar, as the peak flows in the 1940s and 50s were much smaller than the large floods that occurred at the turn of the 20th century, and insufficient to remove vegetation that was establishing in the channel at that time. Mean peak flows declined further from the 1970s through the present, and vegetation continued to expand rapidly across the formerly wide channel. Thus, most of the narrowing observed along the Escalante has been accomplished by native vegetation prior to the invasion of Russian olive. However, as in other reaches, the channel in the upstream reach, mapped here, continued to narrow during the invasion and prior to treatment of Russian olive, but widened slightly over 7 post-treatment years. As to why upstream reaches narrowed more than downstream reaches during the Russian olive invasion, and then widened following treatment, the timing of Russian olive establishment during the invasion appears to have played an important role. As shown in this graph, plotting the number of Russian olive stems establishing in a particular year, rapid establishment of Russian olive occurred 10 years, at least 10 years earlier, and over a longer period of time in upstream reaches, as indicated by the gray bars, compared with downstream reaches, as indicated by the blue bars. This suggests that Russian olive cover would have been greater in upstream reaches and therefore more efficient at trapping sediment and narrowing the channel. In fact, a mapping of Russian olive cover, indicated by the aqua polygons, shows higher cover of near-channel Russian olive in an upstream reach on the right, compared with a downstream reach shown here on the left. Our interpretation is that these dense near channel stands in upstream reaches would have trapped more sediment and produced a narrower channel than would have occurred in the absence of these dense bands. Thus, the channel widened following treatment as the channel adjusted to the current flow and the presence of less dense native vegetation. Conversely, the less dense cover of Russian olive in downstream reaches did not affect the channel to the same degree, and following treatment, downstream reaches continued to narrow in response to the current flow regime and the continued presence of native vegetation. This figure provides a graphical summary of our interpretation of the differing responses of upstream and downstream reaches following the invasion and treatment of Russian olive. First, prior to Russian olive invasion, upstream channels were narrower than downstream channels. And this was controlled largely by differences in flow magnitude, which was reflecting the earlier large turn of the 20th century floods. Second, during the invasion and prior to treatment of Russian olive, greater Russian olive cover in upstream reaches led to more levee building and greater relative channel narrowing than occurred in downstream reaches. And finally, following treatment, upstream reaches widened as levees eroded, while downstream reaches continued to narrow as channels approached similar widths that are now controlled primarily by the continued presence of native vegetation and its interaction with the current flow regime.